Hi, and welcome to TozziniFreire's podcast, the connection between one of the Brazil top law firms, a variety of themes under the business law, and you.
Hi everyone, welcome to TozziniFreire's podcast. I'm Calil and I'm with Leonardo Miranda today. We are partners in infrastructure and energy practice here at TozziniFreire. To join us today, we are pleased to introduce Elina Teplinsky. She's the global energy industry leader at Pillsbury Law, an international law firm with a leading energy practice. She is also the co-leader of the firm's hydrogen practice and a leading member of the firm's international projects team. She has worked on energy transactions and matters in more than 30 countries.
Thank you so much for having me on, Leonardo.
Thanks for joining us, Elina. For this episode, we have invited Elina to talk about the latest innovations, opportunities, and challenges in the energy transition, considering the global scenario. So, Elina, to start our conversation, you have recently traveled to Dubai to participate in the COP28. What are your thoughts on the discussions held by governments during the meeting and the objectives defined in the within COP28?
A great question, Leo. I was really fortunate to be at this COP. I think in many ways it was a historic one because it was the first one to come out with what's known with a global as a global stocktake. It's basically taking stock of where countries are with their commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in compliance with their obligations under the Paris Agreement. And one of the big pieces of discussion was this potential to move away from fossil fuels. This is something that had been discussed for quite some time over several COPs. And of course, we're in the UAE, which is a member of OPEC and an oil-producing nation, and we have quite a few oil-producing nations at the table, and many countries that are, very heavily reliant on fossil fuels, whether it is coal, natural gas, oil, or other fossil fuels. And in this global stocktake, more than 130 countries that are parties to these climate change agreements were able to agree on a transition away from fossil fuels. So that's really huge. It doesn't mean that there will be no fossil fuels. Of course, there are many sectors that need to be decarbonized, and petroleum products are still needed for certain types of sectors. But the fact that these countries were able to agree on this transition away from fossil fuels is really historic. And it kind of paves a path for what is going to be in actually COP30, which is when the country's national commitments on compliance with the Paris Agreement come out. So it kind of represents a trajectory to where we're seeking to go. And as part of this energy transition, there were some very aggressive pledges that were made. One of them is tripling renewable energy output by the countries, which is quite historic. Another one was doubling energy efficiency. And then there was a third one also that wasn't part of the global stocktake, although it did, the global stocktake did indeed list nuclear energy as one of the ways to transition away from fossil fuels. But separately on the sidelines, there were more than 20 countries that kind of started a pledge, signed a pledge to triple nuclear energy capacity worldwide. And it was kind of an open pledge to which other countries can sign on to. So that was really historic as well, especially because if you look at, 2 COPs ago, nuclear wasn't even part of the discussion at the COP. So that is quite significant. So lots of big announcements and, sort of commitments, political commitments being made.
Indeed, these are very important commitments to be undertaken by the countries for the next couple of years. Based on what you heard at COP and the role of the most important players in the energy transition debate, What should be considered as basic steps towards net zero?
So that's a very good question, Anna. These are very ambitious pledges that were made, and the question is, how do we actually implement them in practice? One important thing to understand is that in the past, when we've talked about climate change mitigation and the energy transition, typically people think about the power sector. And certainly the power sector is responsible for a significant percentage of emissions, about 25% globally. But that leaves the other 75% on the table. And the other 75% is actually much more difficult to decarbonize because these sectors are more difficult to electrify, which is something we can do with the power sector. What are those sectors? So principally, we're talking about transportation, which is aviation, marine transportation. We're talking about trucking, medium to long haul trucking. We're talking about industry. Things like steel production, for example, responsible for about 9% of global emissions, cement production, other industrial processes, which are very heavy energy users. We're also talking about agriculture, that's about 10% of emissions. And last but not least, we're talking about heating and cooling. So there are countries, like the UAE, for example, where the COP was held, that are very heavily dependent on the ability to provide adequate cooling for both, their citizens and therefore industry. And of course, we have all the northern countries which are dependent on heating. And all of this is currently mostly coming from natural gas, which is unabated. Very little is actually electrified. So we have to think about, beyond just decarbonizing and electrifying the power sectors, how do we decarbonize these hard to abate sectors? One of the tools to do this that has been, kind of suggested by many governments and worked on by many governments is hydrogen. And because hydrogen is an energy carrier, it can be used in lots of different types of processes, including industrial processes. It can be a zero carbon fuel for all of those hard to abate transportation sectors. It can also be used as a medium for energy storage, and it can produce things like ammonia, for example, which is a fertilizer used in agriculture. So hydrogen is something that has really been taken up as the silver knife of decarbonization. There's still a lot that needs to be done to realize the potential of clean hydrogen. And of course, the hydrogen also needs to be produced with a clean energy source in order to make it clean. So that's one tool that we have. And then in addition, we have other limitations we need to address, like land use issues, for example. So with the pledge to triple renewable capacity, that is a, sort of an easy pledge to make because most people support renewables, right? We want to see more renewables, but you have the issues of land use. Because both solar and wind require significant amounts of land and are increasingly, kind of facing, this NIMBYism where, people do not want, their land covered with solar panels or wind turbines, in proximity of their homes. Offshore wind kind of has its limitations as well. And of course, there are the energy efficiency issues, and the need for battery storage and the need to site more transmission, which people also don't like. So we're kind of this crossroads where we need to figure out the solutions to some of these issues. And I think it's important that we saw at the COP, there was a recognition that the problem is huge. Right? These commitments are very large, and what we really need are all the different sources. So we need hydrogen, we need renewables. We also need to keep some of the fossil fuels like natural gas and abate them, right? We need carbon capture and storage, and we need new, sources of baseload energy like nuclear that have both energy and heat that can be used for lots of different uses. So I think there's a kind of a growing recognition that we need all the tools that we can possibly get, and maybe even new ones, right? New technologies, more investment into R&D to try to really make these commitments a reality.
Perfect. It is nice to hear that the energy transition debate has so many perspectives and how those perspectives are observed by different industries. You know, Elina, one of our partners, Vladimir Abreu, also attended the COP and prepared a brief summary on our participation in the meeting, available on our website. I think Leo can go through our last question.
Yes, of course. And Elina, you mentioned, by the way, COP 30 or 30th, if you like. And it's worth remembering that that's going to be in Brazil, north of Brazil, in Belém, in next year, actually, I would say in 2 years' time, but it's 24 already. So we'll all be there. And so speaking of Brazil, and we know you are an expert from outside Brazil, about Brazil. So you've been following what Brazil is doing within this tremendous boom of renewables and our tracking of hydrogen. And you just mentioned carbon capture. We are on the verge of creating our own regulatory scheme of carbon capture and our own regulated market for carbon. So what do you believe is our country's, Brazil's role in the global energy transition path, and what should be considered as opportunities and challenges?
Absolutely, Leo. I always welcome a chance to come to Brazil, so I will be there for sure at COP 23. COP 30, and I'm really excited to see what Brazil will do before that COP. So I think Brazil is kind of in an interesting position. It has been this tension between the north and the south, with countries that have very heavily industrialized, really being responsible for most of the emissions, but now pushing some of these requirements that can be viewed as kind of stemming industry onto countries that are still in the process of development. I think Brazil is a little bit in its own category because Brazil is kind of very naturally lucky in the amount of hydropower that it has. So it already has, a decarbonized grid in many ways. It has a decarbonized economy. It has been able to bring on a lot of renewables on board, in addition to hydro, solar and wind. Really has very little coal, already has nuclear. So Brazil's in a really good place. Of course, Brazil, I think it's under some pressure because of the Amazon being viewed as, the lungs of the world, of keeping that resource rather than, dedicating it to other uses. So Brazil is in that category in a way where it's not necessarily under a lot of pressure to decarbonize because it's there. But at the same time, I think Brazil stands to reap significant opportunity from the energy transition. And this is really what I think we've been advising our clients, and I'm sure you have as well, including those that are more in the fossil fuel sector, that the energy transition should not be viewed as necessarily a limitation, but it's just an evolution and an opportunity to really expand, what you're currently doing. So as you mentioned, Brazil has so much industry that's kind of budding, right? And real experience in developing energy projects, and successfully doing so. It has a lot of the land that other countries are missing. It has a huge shoreline that many countries would be, really, really envious of. So it has so much potential, with hydrogen, for example. There are already so many projects that have been announced, and the sort of relative proximity compared to other places, like Australia, for example, which is much further away, relative proximity to, to energy heavy end users that are limited, like most European countries. So, Brazil, for example, has the opportunity to produce hydrogen and to produce ammonia, and not just for its internal uses, but to ship it to Europe. Also, technologically a very capable country. So, as someone who works in the nuclear sector, I've always been really amazed with the Brazilian nuclear industry, which is, relatively small, but really capable in every part of the nuclear fuel cycle. And with this, pledge to triple nuclear capacity, Brazil has such an opportunity to increase its share, not just for domestic production, but for everything from, small modular reactors to nuclear fuel production, and technology and everything else. And I think similarly is the case for carbon capture. You mentioned, Leo, with the new framework, the ability to demonstrate carbon capture technology and actually potentially, export some of this expertise. So I think for Brazil, it's really the opportunity is to enter, more solidly into the global supply chain for the energy transition and use all of the capabilities that currently exist to really become a key global player. So I hope to see that come to fruition in the next couple of years.
We hope so. Elina, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciated your participation on today's episode to share your outstanding knowledge and perspective on energy transition.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you, Leo. Always a pleasure to speak to you, and best of luck with everything.
We did appreciate it, Elina. Thank you so much. We're sure that you have brought great insights to our audience towards a more sustainable and efficient energy future in Brazil and worldwide. Thank you so much.
And if you enjoyed this conversation, we invite you to know more about us on our website and to follow us on our social media networks. See you there.